Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're tackling Socrates. I think it's especially cool that you brought these Italian sources, and it's going to be fun to kind of dig into this with you. I mean, it's interesting because right away we run into this paradox where we're trying to understand this guy Socrates who never wrote anything down, but yet he's like this huge, giant in the history of thought. So where do we even begin with that?
Right. That's the real mystery of it. We basically have to rely on what other people said about him, like Plato and Xenophon. They're kind of our main sources, so
Yeah.
it's like our lens for understanding this guy.
Okay, so right from the start, we're dealing with all this interpretation. I mean, we're getting Socrates filtered through someone else's point of view, and that makes me wonder. I mean, did they get him right?
Yeah, that's a question that I think historians are always wrestling with. I mean, how objective were they really? Did their own relationships with Socrates, do their own agendas or biases, did that color how they portrayed him?
Yeah, totally. And speaking of agendas and bias, some of these Italian sources really lean into this idea of Socrates as a puzzle. There's this one quote that I thought was really interesting. This scholar describes him as a living contradiction.
Oh yeah, I know that one. I
Yeah.
think it's that. It really gets to the heart of why he's so hard to pin down. On the one hand, he's all about this simple lifestyle, rejecting material wealth.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's spending all his time, in these intense intellectual debates
Yeah.
with some of the most powerful people in Athens.
Right. So it's this contrast, and that contrast also shows up in his teaching style, at least from what I've been reading in these Italian texts. Socrates wasn't about lecturing or claiming to have all the answers. Instead, he had this totally unique approach, what we call the Socratic method. And it was all about challenging assumptions and getting people to think critically.
Yeah, the Socratic method is so interesting because it's not really about just giving people information directly. It's more about helping them draw out, the knowledge and insights that are already inside them.
Yeah, there's this passage that I read, I think it was in one of these sources. It describes Socrates as an intellectual midwife.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was such a great image. He wasn't trying to force his ideas on people. It was more like he was helping them give birth to their own understanding.
Exactly. And he did that with these two main techniques, irony and what we call maieutic, so a Socratic irony. He would kind of pretend to be ignorant, and he would ask these questions that seemed really simple on the surface, but they were designed to expose the flaws and contradictions in the other person's argument.
So it wasn't about being sarcastic or making fun of them.
Well, some scholars think it could be pretty cutting at times, but the main point was to kind of dismantle the argument intellectually. By pretending not to know, he could lead people down this path of questioning until they reach their own conclusions.
It's interesting because these Italian sources, they actually have a few different interpretations of Socratic irony. One scholar even suggests that sometimes it was a way to humiliate your opponent in a debate.
Yeah, it definitely had the potential to be misused, even though the goal was supposed to be to help people see the truth more clearly.
And then there's this other technique, maeutics, or the art of midwifery. That's where Socrates used these really carefully crafted questions to guide people towards self-discovery. It seems like a much more subtle approach, almost like they're collaborating in the learning process.
Yeah, definitely. And this was a radical departure from the way teaching was usually done in ancient Athens. Back then, knowledge was often treated as something that authorities possessed and controlled.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how people reacted to this. I mean, did they embrace it or did it create resistance?
Well, these Italian sources suggest a bit of both.
Yeah.
Some people were drawn to Socrates. They loved his intellect and his ability to make them think critically. But others, especially those in power, they felt threatened by him. I mean, if you start questioning assumptions, it can be pretty destabilizing, especially in a society that values tradition and hierarchy.
Right. And that makes me think about how Socrates' ideas, how they might be received today. I mean, we live in this world of information overload, where it's so easy to just get swept away by persuasive rhetoric and unquestioned assumptions.
Yeah, it's like a modern day version of ancient Athens in a way. Back then you had the sophists, these master rhetoricians and debaters. They were super influential. And just like Socrates challenged their methods, I think he would have a lot to say about how information is shared and consumed today.
That's such an interesting comparison. I'd love to unpack that a bit more. But before we do, I'm curious to learn more about Socrates' own beliefs. These Italian sources really seem to emphasize this connection between knowledge, virtue, and happiness. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah, that triad is like the foundation of Socratic philosophy. He believed that true knowledge is self-knowledge. It's not just about understanding the world around us, but also understanding our own place in it, who we are and how we fit into the bigger picture.
So from that self-knowledge, Socrates believed virtue kind of naturally followed.
Yeah, he saw virtue as more than just a set of rules, It was about a deep understanding of what is truly good and just, and then aligning your actions with that understanding.
So it's not enough to just do the right thing. You have to understand why it's right.
Exactly. It's about living a life guided by reason and a commitment to what's truly valuable. And for Socrates, this pursuit of virtue was like totally intertwined with happiness.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. A lot of these Italian sources talk about how Socrates saw happiness as a direct outcome of this virtuous life, a life that's guided by knowledge and self-understanding.
Yeah, and that idea, it challenges a lot of modern ideas about happiness. We often focus on, achievements or possessions. But Socrates was saying true happiness is an inner state. It's a product of living in accordance with reason and virtue.
There's this one quote that really stuck with me. I think it was from one of these Italian sources. Socrates says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's like he's saying that without self-reflection and the pursuit of knowledge, we're missing out on something essential.
Yeah, that quote really sums up the essence of Socratic thought. He believed that seeking wisdom and self-understanding, it wasn't just some intellectual exercise, it was a fundamental part of living a meaningful life.
It's almost like he's saying true happiness comes from aligning your actions with your values, like living in harmony with your deepest self. Yeah. And that brings us back to that comparison with the sophists.
Right, the sophists are a really interesting contrast to Socrates. They were these amazing rhetoricians, masters of persuasion. And they often taught their students how to win arguments, even if it meant ignoring the truth.
Yeah, one source describes them as merchants of words, like they were selling their skills to the highest bidder, which is so different from Socrates, who thought that the pursuit of truth should always be the ultimate goal.
Totally. The sophists were often focused on worldly success, power and influence. They achieved that through persuasion. But Socrates saw true knowledge as something that transcended all that.
So it's like they represent these two different paths. One focused on outward appearances and manipulation, and the other focused on inner truth and genuine understanding. And this clash really plays out in the story of Socrates' trial.
Yeah, the trial is one of the most famous events in Socrates' life. And these Italian sources offer some interesting perspectives on the accusations against him. Impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens.
That impiety charge is really weird to me. How could someone so dedicated to self-knowledge and virtue be accused of disrespecting the gods?
Well, we have to remember the social and political context of ancient Athens.
Yeah.
Socrates was always questioning traditional beliefs, and he encouraged critical thinking. And for some people, that was a threat to the established order.
Yeah, one scholar even argues that the accusations were politically motivated. Like Socrates' enemies used these charges to silence him and his radical ideas.
That's definitely a possibility. Socrates was totally committed to the truth. And he wasn't afraid to challenge authority, so he probably made some powerful enemies along the way. And that charge of corrupting the youth, it might have come from the fact that his teachings encouraged young people to think for themselves and question authority.
So they saw him as a dangerous influence, someone who could undermine Athenian society. But even when he was facing these serious charges, Socrates refused to compromise his principles.
Yeah, his decision to drink hemlock rather than give up his beliefs, it says so much about his conviction and his commitment to living a life guided by truth and virtue.
This Italian sources really capture how dramatic that moment was. It wasn't just a tragic ending. It was like a powerful statement about his dedication to his principles.
And in doing so, he became a symbol of intellectual freedom, a martyr for the pursuit of truth. And his legacy still inspires us today.
Speaking of his legacy, these sources also talk about how Socrates' ideas continue to influence Western thought, especially through his most famous student, Plato.
Right, Plato took those Socratic ideas, self-knowledge, virtue, happiness, and he developed them into this whole philosophical system. He explored things like the theory of forms, which says that there's this realm of perfect and unchanging ideas that exist beyond the physical world.
It's like Plato took the seed of Socratic thought and turned it into this huge philosophical garden. And it's amazing to think about how these ideas that were born in ancient Athens, they still resonate with us today.
Totally. The themes of self-discovery and the pursuit of truth and the importance of living a virtuous life, they're just as relevant now as they were back then. Maybe even more so in a world that often seems to value superficiality and external validation over genuine self-reflection.
It makes you wonder what Socrates would think if he were alive today. Would he be encouraging us to question our reliance on technology, or our obsession with material possessions, or our often pretty shallow understanding of happiness?
It's a fascinating question to think about, and it shows how powerful Socratic thought is. It challenges us to examine ourselves and the world more deeply, to question our assumptions, and to strive for a life that's truly aligned with our values.
These sources also go beyond just the philosophy. They talk about how Socrates' image has been shaped over time, especially through sculpture.
Oh yeah, the power of visual representation. The Roman copies of Lysippos' sculptures of Socrates, they've become so iconic. They show him with this rugged, almost homely appearance, which is really different from how other philosophers were portrayed.
Right, and one source even suggests that those sculptures contributed to this image of Socrates as the philosopher of the people. Like, he was approachable and engaged with everyday life, not some aloof intellectual in an ivory tower.
It's a great reminder of how much visual imagery can influence us. Even though these sculptures were created way after Socrates died, they've become part of our collective imagination.
It's like they've added another layer to this already complex puzzle of Socrates. And these Italian sources, with their unique perspectives, they've helped us appreciate just how multifaceted his legacy really is.
Yeah, they've pushed us to look beyond the simplified narratives, to really engage with the nuances of his thought, and to recognize how relevant his ideas are to our own lives.
You know, before we wrap up, I want to go back to that idea of Socratic virtue and happiness. It's something that's been really sticking with me throughout this deep dive.
Sure, what specifically has resonated with you?
Well, these Italian sources emphasize how Socrates saw virtue as something that naturally came from true knowledge. Like, when we understand what's good and just, we're naturally inclined to act accordingly.
That's a really important point. It's not about forcing ourselves to be virtuous through willpower or fear of punishment. It's about developing a deep understanding of what's right and letting that understanding guide our actions.
And these sources suggest that this alignment between knowledge and action is what leads to real happiness. It's not about chasing pleasure or avoiding pain. It's about living in harmony with our deepest selves.
It's a powerful idea. It suggests that true happiness isn't something we find outside ourselves, but rather something we cultivate within, through the pursuit of knowledge, virtue, and self-understanding.
It's like he's saying that when you live in harmony with your true self, happiness just naturally follows.
Yeah, that idea really resonates, doesn't it? It speaks to this desire we all have for a sense of purpose and meaning that goes beyond just superficial pleasures.
And it reminds me of that quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's like Socrates is telling us to take responsibility for our own happiness by constantly reflecting on ourselves and trying to understand who we really are.
It's a powerful call to action that's relevant no matter the time or place, and I think these Italian sources have done a great job of highlighting that.
Well, this has been an amazing journey. We started by trying to understand this guy who never wrote anything down, and we ended up exploring these huge questions about knowledge, virtue, and happiness.
It really shows the lasting power of Socrates' legacy, that his ideas still have so much meaning for us today.
And these Italian sources gave us this whole new perspective on his legacy.
They've challenged us to think critically, question our assumptions, and engage in this ongoing process of self-examination, which was at the core of Socrates' philosophy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling really grateful for this opportunity to explore these ideas, and I'm feeling inspired to embrace that Socratic spirit of inquiry in my own life.
And maybe that's the best way to honor Socrates, to keep the conversation going, to keep asking questions, and to strive for a life of wisdom, virtue, and genuine happiness, just like he did.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Socrates. We hope you found it as enriching and thought-provoking as we have. It's interesting, right? We've been talking about how, for Socrates, true happiness comes from aligning our actions with what we know is right, but how do you actually do that, in our world today where everything is so fast-paced and kind of crazy?
Yeah, it's a question that people have been asking for centuries, and these Italian sources, some really interesting thoughts on this. They point out that Socrates didn't think you could just learn virtue from a book or a lecture. It was something you had to discover through self-examination, by wrestling with tough questions and facing your own biases.
So it's not about following some set of rules or like a predetermined path.
Nope, not at all. It's more about cultivating a certain way of thinking, a willingness to always be reflecting on yourself and to question even the things you believe most strongly. And that's where the Socratic method becomes more than just a teaching technique. It's a way of life.
That's so cool. And some of these sources actually give some pretty practical advice about how to use Socratic principles in everyday life. One author talks about starting with those small interactions you have every day, like instead of just accepting someone's opinion, maybe ask some clarifying questions to really get what they're saying.
Yeah, it's about being curious, wanting to dig deeper and get to the heart of things. And you can apply that to anything, like reading a news article, talking to a friend, even making a decision about your career.
I love that. Finding those little ways to practice Socratic thinking makes it feel less daunting, like something we can all try.
Exactly. And the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. It's like you start to see the world differently and question things you used to just accept without thinking, and you always want to understand things on a deeper level.
But the sources also say that this kind of self-reflection can be tough sometimes, right? It can make you face parts of yourself that you'd rather avoid.
Oh, absolutely. The journey of self-discovery can be challenging. It takes honesty and courage and a willingness to deal with some uncomfortable truths. But Socrates believed the rewards were huge.
He thought this process of self-discovery was key to living a virtuous and fulfilling life.
Exactly. It's by understanding ourselves, our good and bad qualities, our values, what motivates us. That's how we can start to live in a way that's true to who we are. And for Socrates, that was the ultimate path to happiness.
It's a really powerful idea. It makes you think about all the ways we try to find happiness from outside ourselves, through accomplishments, things we buy, even relationships. But maybe Socrates is saying that real happiness comes from within.
That's a big takeaway from these Italian sources. They highlight how Socrates saw happiness not as this fleeting feeling or something you get. It was a state of being. It was what happened when you lived a virtuous life, one that's aligned with knowledge and self-understanding.
So like when you're living in harmony with your true self, happiness just comes naturally.
Yes, exactly. And that idea, it really sticks with you, doesn't it? It speaks to that deep desire we all have for a sense of purpose and meaning, something that goes beyond just superficial pleasures.
And it brings to mind that quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It's like Socrates is urging us to take control of our own happiness by always reflecting on ourselves and trying to figure out who we really are.
It's a powerful message that's still relevant today. And these Italian sources have done a fantastic job of showing us that.
This has been such an amazing journey. We started trying to understand a man who never wrote anything down, and we ended up discussing these profound questions about knowledge and virtue and happiness.
It really shows how influential Socrates was, that his ideas still mean so much to us all these years later.
And these Italian sources gave us a whole new way of looking at his legacy. They showed us sides of him we might not have seen otherwise.
They've pushed us to think critically, question our assumptions, and keep examining ourselves, which was so important to Socrates' philosophy.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I feel grateful that we had this chance to explore these ideas, and I'm feeling inspired to bring that Socratic way of thinking into my own life.
And maybe that's the best way we can honor Socrates, to keep the conversation going, to keep asking questions, and to work towards a life of wisdom, virtue, and true happiness, just like he did.
Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of Socrates. We hope you found it as enriching and thought-provoking as we have.